operation at NAS Whidbey Island, single-sided against their own national policies. The new noise was alarming. People all over the region responded. The noise profile of the new jets contained a loud, high frequency and a low frequency noise that caused structures to vibrate and gave rise to the Growler's name. All in all, a louder noise profile than the Prowlers. Although the Navy promised the public that the Growlers would be fewer in number and not as loud as the Prowlers, neither ended up being the truth. By 2012, the Growlers began training over Puget Sound. People responded by organizing local groups throughout Puget Sound, in the San Juans, in Jefferson County, and the Olympic Peninsula. Citizens of Eby's Reserve was among the first of the groups that organized and began what would become an important part of their activist history of lawsuits against the Navy over its Growler jet expansions in Northwest Washington. COER initiated the first NEPA lawsuit against the Navy and an injunction to stop the jets from flying until that first EIS had been completed. Unfortunately, that failed. The Sound Defense Alliance emerged as a regional organization in July of 2018, bringing smaller groups and individuals into a larger collaboration with a regional focus and providing a bigger and united voice. The summarized activities listed on this very long timeline chronicle the work of our advocates and our collaborators and what we have done to protect our communities over 7 counties around Puget Sound, the Salish Sea, and the Olympic Peninsula, providing education, research, legal challenges, experts, and important data on noise and health. Multiple noise studies, for example, have been done by the Department of Interior from Eby's Landing, the Navy's noise study directed by Congress, the Lilly noise studies, Lauren's, who's here with us today, Lauren Keeney's noise study in the Olympic Peninsula, and the Orca Whales noise study. The University of Washington's health study was a highlight, a groundbreaking health study on military jet noise. It made Edmund Zito famous on a national scene because this was really innovative work and hasn't been done other places. We've created a film, Plain Truths, other multiple films and videos. We've had many investigative reporter articles. And since 2020, SDA has held at least 10 listening sessions, 12 webinars, and community discussions, 4 environmental film screenings, 12 podcast episodes. And between 2012 and 2026, over 10 lawsuits have been filed against the Navy from our advocates, People Against Noise, and in general against the Navy's doing other things in its expansion in the Northwest Washington. Some of these are, Ground Zero, Center for Nonviolent Action, the Forest Service employees, the Suquamish Tribe, Puget Soundkeepers Alliance, and the Washington Environmental Council on a Clean Water Act lawsuit, the National Parks Conservation Association, the Sussman Godfrey Law Firm, the NEPA lawsuits instigated by COER and the Attorney General. And after having done the last EIS against the Navy, we finally had a win, and probably because the Attorney General was involved in that lawsuit. But it's an unusual day when a local community group wins against the Navy. So that put us on a national map where we have helped others chronicle and tell people what we've done and how we've done it, because there are other groups who are resisting military jet noise in their own communities throughout the country. And so most recently, COER is challenging the final amended EIS for an inadequate response to the El Centro option for moving some of the jets there. And they're initiating an Endangered Species Act on behalf of the marbled murrelet. So this advocacy work that we've done over the last 10 years, a lot of it has been really groundbreaking. And I can't think of another group in the United States that has such a long record of peaceful protests that protect our communities from military expansion and intrusion than the advocates and our collaborators who've been working with us for the last 10 years here in Northwest Washington. I think it's truly amazing. And the Navy counts on small groups fading away, and we have been able to sustain a long-term commitment to resisting what we think is inappropriate for our communities. So we've inspired a lot of other people around the country. We have had some important wins. We have motivated others to take action. We've pushed the Navy into doing its own noise study. We've seen the Navy provide noise abatement measures to the Oak Harbor and Coopville school systems as a result of our work. And it's a big and, our advocacy has informed our research. The results of this work provides opportunities for new research and for informed new environmental and public health policies based on data and science, and current data and science. I want to emphasize that all of this groundbreaking work has been initiated by people like you and me, individuals who believe in justice, fairness, and our right to have a military that protects us, not harms us in our homes, at work, and at play. So this new timeline that we've created for you is available on SDA's website, and you can go there, and the documents related to this timeline are there for you to link to, so you can read the actual documents and that go with these little pieces in the timeline. So it was really fun to make this, and it certainly validated my I was amazed to see it all in a long line like this about what we've done for the last 10 years. But it's been Mount Everest and Death Valley work. We've had our highs and lows, and we're happy to have you join us today. And I'm passing off to Lauren, who is going to share more information with you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Marianne. Yeah, that was a really good introduction. And I also thought that the timeline was a really good idea. I probably first learned about the growlers, came to my attention in 2015, 2016, when I experienced hearing them out on the Olympic Peninsula. But then the initial Olympic Peninsula study started because someone that lived on Decatur Island emailed the department, the University of Washington, and said, hey, does anybody know about the impacts on wildlife? And I ended up responding to that person. And that's how the Olympic study was sort of born, because they asked if we knew anything about wildlife impacts. And I said, no, not only do we not know, but I said, probably nobody knows. I think it's also really instructive that the population health study that was published a couple of years ago by Geo and Edmund and Julian and myself, that study actually came out of, so that's this slide here that you're showing here, that UW Tier 2 study. That study kind of had its origins in a donation to the Sound Defense Alliance for some community noise monitoring, which Chris Hurley recruited me to advise on. Edmund gave us loaned us the protocols for it. And what Chris and I realized is when we were doing that noise monitoring, we said, look, we actually have a lot of data. What we need is someone that can do something with these data and tell us what it means. And so Chris and I recruited Edmund at that point. So I think where I'm going, and there's other examples too of this sort of integration of how there's a lot of unknowns with respect to noise. We're dealing in noise in general, and especially in the United States, but really everywhere, is what would be considered very weakly regulated, very weakly regulated. So unlike with the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, we do not have corresponding strong regulations that limit noise, either emissions from products or environmental noise, either one of them. And that leads to very, very, very low information environments. And it also leads to limited levers, political levers that you can pull, or legal levers that you can pull in order to enact change. And so I have been watching Sound Defense Alliance and COER and Quiet Skies and all of these communities working within this environment, which is very challenging, and having success. As Marion said, it is difficult for community organizations to sustain themselves. I would say that it's even more difficult when you're working in an environment that has few regulations and very little information. There's not a lot of noise research in general is just a very limited field of study. So I think this timeline is a way of sort of showing the progress, showing the intense progress and the intense work that has gone into and have made a difference. So another point, actually, this tier 2 study that Geo was the lead author on, this was possible because of the Navy's noise monitoring data that was collected because of Sound Defense Alliance and other organizations' advocacy, right? Like we were not able to do this research without that legislation that forced the sound monitoring study to be done. So yeah, it takes a village. It takes a village. So today, Edmund and I are going to talk about now, I was just showing this tier 2 study as a refresher, but that was the population health mapping. But today, Edmund and I are going to, oh, next slide. Today, Edmund and I are going to be sharing the results of the tier 3 study. So from that population health modeling, that showed kind of at a population level what were the projected health risks, but that doesn't really tell you about necessarily the individual, more of an individual level or the lived experience, right? So this tier 3 study focused on that, and it had two different questions in this tier 3 study. One was, how does noise exposure from military aviation relate to community? How does it impact the community? What are the community responses like? And then the second part, we focused mostly on data sets of noise complaints to describe this more lived experience. And we wanted to collectively, this tier 3 study emphasizes the community experience, the community response. And today, Edmund is going to, for about 20 minutes, Edmund is going to talk about the first half of this tier 3 study, which was the community survey. And one of those, the one that Edmund's going to talk about, was published like 10 days ago. So that's exciting. And then the second half of it, I will talk about the analysis of the noise complaints, and which we're submitting. The research is essentially finished. We've submitted it once, and we're going to be in the review process for a while now. And then hopefully, what we're hoping is that since this is sort of the first look that folks have had of these research, including people that have contributed to it, probably, I'm sure there's people on this call that contributed to this that are just learning about this right now. We would love to get feedback, ideas, thoughts on how we can package or, what these research results mean for, the use of communities, both here in Washington, around Whidbey Island, but maybe even elsewhere as well. So the tier 3 study goals were, as 1, conduct a community survey to assess health and quality of life outcomes, and 2 was to analyze these noise complaint data, to characterize the reported noise and health impacts. And then 3 is we're still working on this a little bit, but kind of thinking about maybe that's what we're hoping to maybe get some impact put or questions and answers about, how do we use this work, leverage this work meaningfully for both communities around Whidbey Island or potentially elsewhere. So, okay, I think I'm handing it over to Edmund now. What's the next slide, Tara? Okay, Edmund, it's all you for till slide 21, I think.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. So as Lauren mentioned, this is actually our second study that we're presenting as part of, this is our fourth community workshop. But in the previous community workshops, we presented our first paper, or the first paper that was funded under the Population Initiative Studies. And if you attended those workshops, you would have recalled Geo was presenting how we used modeled noise levels to estimate population health impacts. And those estimates were largely based on other people's studies, what other people have found for a given noise level, what um, community annoyance might be, what might cardiovascular disease rates might be, and et cetera, and so on. But they weren't really specific to military aviation noise, and neither were they specific to the military aviation impacted communities in our region. So we felt it was really important to actually do a population health survey that would focus on not noise in general, not traffic noise, not civil aviation noise, but ask specific questions about military aviation noise. And also ask not about a single health endpoint, but ask about a variety of different health outcomes. And we had already had quite a few community meetings going into kind of preparing the proposal for this population health initiative survey. And so the chats, the commentary, and also the existing literature on aviation noise impacts were all being used to guide kind of how we designed this study. As Lauren mentioned, we have this new paper. It was just published a week or two ago. It should be open access, so it should not be behind a paywall. So if you search for this title, it should come up easy to access. And the objectives of the study were to look at annoyance, sleep disturbance, and disruption with daily activities. And we really wanted to compare it with what we understood, from other studies of military aviation noise and civil aviation noise. But we also wanted to look at some other non-acoustic factors that may either exacerbate the effects or not. Those are those non-acoustic factors that are underlined here. Next. And so we went about this by doing a postcard mailer. We had selected 10,000 addresses based on parcel records. In this modeled. These are the modeled noise contours that Geo, the PhD student, did. But we actually sent out postcards over a much wider range, including out over the Olympic Peninsula. Um, and uh, and so you can see here of the 10,000 postcards, it spanned 9 counties, and they are all pre-selected. And so we knew exactly what addresses we're mailing out to get that geographic spread. Next. And for folks who received the postcard and they were interested in participating, they would click on the link and go to an online questionnaire. And there were a variety of questions. It was actually, I don't know how many on the call actually participated in this. But for those of you who did, you may have recalled that it actually was a pretty lengthy survey because we asked so many questions about the noise experience, but also, uh, okay, thanks, Lauren. Um, uh, about the noise experience, but also a variety of different health impacts. And so here's an example of some of the questions that we asked about. There were questions about noise in general. So military aviation noise versus roadway traffic noise versus civil aviation noise, boat traffic noise, etc. Um, and then for military aviation noise, we asked about the frequency and the intensity, and how it disturbs a variety of different daily activities at the household level. We asked about coping strategies, and then we also asked about impacts like on sleep disturbance, on general health, stress, and so forth. Um, So, in order to contextualize the responses, we also asked about demographics. So age, sex, income, education, etc. Next. So this gives you kind of a jittered view of where the postcards were sent. Those black and gray dots represent the approximate locations of households where we mailed out postcards. And perhaps not surprising if any of you have done kind of mail out survey and postcards. We didn't get all that great of a response rate. So out of 10,000 postcards, we only got a little over 600 response. And usually, when you do these surveys, you try and have enough budget where if folks don't respond the first time, you ping them again with a second postcard and a third postcard and a fifth postcard until they eventually feel guilty enough that they would respond. Because our funding was limited, we got what we got. And nevertheless, I mean, we still had a fairly wide distribution of respondents. And when we looked at the demographics, they mirrored, not exactly, but for 600 some people, pretty closely to the demographics that we'd expect for this area. Um, and what's interesting is we actually did have uh, uh, a fair number of respondents that reported that they have some history with the armed forces. And we also asked about sort of perceptions towards the military and the military base. And so that ended up being kind of an interesting non-acoustical factor that we wanted to incorporate into our analysis. Next. So, so here are some of the results from our survey, and I should probably explain this figure. So let's look at the one on the left. Uh, this is these color-coded bars. They all go up to 100%. And so they go from 0% or 100% of the respondents. And the color coding represents how they responded to five different levels of how we asked the question about um, uh, uh, the intensity of the noise, the reported noise level. So dark blue represents no noise, whereas if you see the dark red, that's very noisy. And then each of the columns, the colored columns, the one on the left, sorry for the small font, is military aviation noise. So if you just focus on the bar on the left, you could see a lot of red in that bar, which means a lot of people, when we asked about exposure, perceived exposure to military aviation noise, they felt it was either quite noisy or very noisy. Quite noisy is the lighter red, and very noisy is the darker red. And you see more red in that compared to any of the other sources of noise. So, like roadway traffic noise is the next column over, much less red. So much less people reporting quite noisy or very noisy compared to the military aviation noise. And that generally was the case. So the second column is roadway traffic. The third column is commercial aviation. The fourth column is neighborhood noise. The fifth is boat or shipping. And then the last column is other sources of noise. Okay, so this indicated by far people's experience with noise tended to be most associated with military aviation noise. Those were that kind of source of noise ended up being what they reported as being quite or very noisy. And then in terms of the other sort of acoustical ways in which we characterize noise, the plots on the right-hand side of this figure illustrate the frequency of military aviation noise. And so, like by far the greatest category was uh, uh, experiencing military aviation noise several times per week. Um, And then in terms of the loudness of military aviation noise, you could see very few people responded that they didn't have any exposure to noise. That's the smallest bar on the left. But most people had some experience with noise that they would characterize as loud. So either a category two, three, or at the highest level, it was extremely noisy. And then in terms of the pitch, you could see, most people responded that it was a low rumbly noise. Those are the categories one and two are the lower frequency noises. And that sort of is consistent with what we've seen in our noise complaint data. People generally complain about low frequency noise that shakes their entire house, shakes them to their body to the core, that kind of noise. Next. And what was interesting, because uh, we had asked folks to report their perceived noise. We didn't ask them to go out and measure the noise. We just asked them, like, how would they rate it? A little bit noisy, somewhat noisy, quite noisy, or very noisy. But we separately had the modeled noise exposure maps, the actual dB model dB levels from our previous study. We were able to do a comparison. And you could see that generally people's perceptions rank ordered exactly the same way as the dB levels in which we modeled them. So people's perceptions matched um, the model dB levels quite well. These are box plots where the bar in the middle represents the median. And so it's a measure of central tendency. 50% of the respondents would report higher than the middle bar, and 50% would report lower than that middle bar. And so you could see a lot of spread. The height uh, the the heights of the bars, but also the dots represent just how noisy these data are. But nevertheless, the central tendencies all rank order as we would expect based on our noise modeling. Next. So this is a major finding with respect to how noise, and this is military noise, perceived military noise specifically, and two different health outcomes, high annoyance, as well as sleep disturbance. And what you can see along the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is the percentage of respondents that report in a certain way. And so, um, again, the more red you see represents kind of more extreme noise. And you could see that for both annoyance and sleep disturbance, as the noise levels increase, we have more and more people responding that they're either very annoyed or extremely annoyed, or very sleep disturbed or extremely sleep disturbed. Um, and it's the trends are consistent for both of these outcomes. Next. Okay. So those were interesting findings with respect to kind of our main question, which is how does military aviation noise affect things like high annoyance and sleep disturbance? But there were other data that we had within our survey, and in particular these non-acoustic factors like age and gender, and also social cultural aspects and other perceptions about the military specifically. And we know that a lot of folks who live on the Whidbey Island and who are members of the community have a history of working with the military. And we wanted to see whether or not that might shift some of the relationships between noise and these health outcomes. Next. And in fact, we did find that military service does shift people's perceptions around noise and how it affects their health. So here's some plots that show this effect. You could see again, the more red that you see means they're either very or extremely annoyed. And you can see for folks who don't have that history of military service, there's more red. They're more likely for the same amount of noise, say that they're very or extremely annoyed by military aviation noise compared to those who do have a history of service in the armed forces. They're less likely um, to report that, to report high annoyance. Next. But it's nuanced. And so it's not that folks who've served in the military don't have any effect to noise. And in fact, we do. It's just attenuated. And so you could see that in this slide, um, comparing on the left, those two bars are for folks who are exposed to less noise, whereas on the right, those are folks who are exposed to more noise, higher levels of noise. And you could see that, for both uh, uh, folks who've participants who've served in the military, as well as folks who've served who have not served in the military, um, there's red in both of these. And especially when you look at the high noise level folks, you see a lot of red compared to those who don't have as much noise exposure. And so noise exposure affects both people who have served in the military as well as folks who haven't served in the military. It's just that for lower noise levels, perhaps the history of the armed service makes them less sensitive to noise. Next. So in summary, respondents reported high annoyance, sleep disturbance, and disruption of household activities, generally corresponding to self-reported or perceived military aviation noise exposure. This is one of the few. There's only a handful of military aviation noise studies, and so this is an important peer-reviewed study in the scientific literature. Self-reported military aviation noise exposure and reported impacts increased with modeled average noise exposure, but there's high variation, as we saw, in many of the factors that are difficult to capture, why there's so much variation in perceived noise. The study demonstrates a critical importance of capturing attitudes towards the military, as well as other factors, non-acoustic factors that influence how people are sensitive to noise. Okay. I will now, I think, hand it back over to Lauren,
Yes.
and I will start answering questions in the comments.
Okay, cool. And Tara, we were gonna wait until the end to do the Q&A for everything. Is that right? So yeah, if you want to put questions in the chat, Edmund can answer the ones that he sees now, but other than that, we'll go ahead and wait until the end and have a discussion at the end. Okay, I guess. So I'm going to be presenting the second half of the Tier 3 study, which focused on the noise complaints, basically analyzing, and we'll just call it 10 years of noise complaints collectively that have been collected by Quiet Skies, and then there's actually a data set from the Navy, which I'll talk about too. And I am presenting on behalf of Shirley Huang, who's kind of the lead author on this study. What you're seeing here is our submitted version of the manuscript. So this will eventually be published as peer-reviewed as well. We just are in the submission phase right now. Still have to get it reviewed, but the research is essentially sort of finalized. And again, the focus on this was using noise complaints to describe and characterize sort of the lived experience, more of the lived experience. Okay, next slide. So why would you analyze noise complaints? They are not a substitute for surveys or other types of studies. But unlike surveys are usually limited in resources that you have to talk about, and sometimes limited in the types of responses you can collect. So you have to ask about sleep disturbance or annoyance, and you often can't ask about any number of things. But complaints are what are called unstructured. People just talk about whatever is, bothering them. And so they can be a way to sort of capture the full range of impacts, instead of having to focus on a limited number of responses, quote, this lived experience, right? And there's multiple ways that you can analyze complaints. And we've done all of these, and there's even sort of some additional ones, but we focused on 3. We use something called natural language processing or text analysis to convert or translate the text in complaints into indices of emotion and sentiment, including, say, things like anger, or capturing expressions of profanity, that kind of thing. I'm only going to show the negative sentiment, the anger one, but basically we convert the complaint into something that quantifies sort of the intensity of emotion around it. We can also we also use the text in the complaints to classify complaints into categories to try and demonstrate or document both the range of different categories of impact or different types of impacts, and then also maybe the prevalence. So is everybody complaining about one thing, or are they complaining about a lot of different aspects of the noise, right? And then lastly is that we can analyze what is driving, are there operational factors, or are there situational or environmental factors even that are associated with the highest numbers of complaints, because that can sometimes indicate to you, well, if we could take care of this one operational thing, or this, like what's really driving the complaints, because then maybe that gets at mitigation to some extent. Like what would we mitigate if we were going to try and choose what the top priority is, right? So there's a lot of different reasons and a lot of ways in which complaints can be analyzed systematically and to offer really valuable information. So that was why we took this approach. Okay, next slide. So there are 2 different noise complaint data sets that we used, and then we combined that with some operational information that we had. So the first noise complaint data set, probably many people have contributed to it or are at least familiar with it. Quiet Skies over San Juan County since 2014 has been collecting noise complaints. For the first 5 years, they collected noise complaints within San Juan County. And then around late 2019, I think mid to late 2019, they opened that up to be collect noise complaints from anywhere. And in the Quiet Skies data set, people can leave a comment or not. They can either just leave a georeferenced location of a noise complaint, but many people do include free text comments. It will track the date and time. You can tell when the date and time of the incident was or the complaint was logged. And then there's a way to document sort of the noise type as well, and the aircraft as well. So there's that one, and we had access to those data through, I think, from 2020 on is when those were the data that we're using. Okay, next slide. The second data set was very unique and well, they're both helpful, especially in combination, but part of COER's work, they at one point did a Freedom of Information Act, and one of the types of information that they requested was 4 years of complaint data from the Naval Air Station Whidbey Island noise complaint system. Now, of course, ordinarily, we would not have access to those data, but through this Freedom of Information Act process, which was very, very lengthy, we did have access to 4 years of complaint data from that Navy line. Probably many people on this call are familiar with the complaint system. It's a recorded line, or you can email. So the data that gets captured in the Navy's complaint line database is the free text comment from the person's, complaint or comment. They assign it. It's not a latitude and longitude point, but there is a city and a zip code level of location, date and time of the incident or the comment, and then interestingly, the Navy does identify to a unique household identifier. So if people call back and leave multiple complaints, we can track we know that individual, and that's a difference from the Quiet Skies one. The Quiet Skies data, there's not really any there's not a great way to assign individuals, but the Navy complaint line, can be assigned to, an individual. Of course, we don't have access to the Freedom of Information Act. No, we don't have anybody's names. There's no names associated because that's all redacted. I want to be clear about that. Nobody's names were associated with it, but there is an identifier that says this person is a numbered identifier, right? Okay, so next slide. So actually, by joining these two, we had the 4 years from 2017 to 2020 from the Navy complaint line. And then because Quiet Skies wasn't collecting county-wide, but after 2020, Quiet Skies was collecting, outside of the county, the whole county, we then sort of have more comparable data sets, which to a researcher is terrible. This was terrifying to have two different data sets. They're collected in different ways. That was terrifying, but it'll work out. I promise. I'll show you later. It does end up working out. But collectively, we ended up with 7 years. We had 2023 to 20. For Quiet Skies, we ended up analyzing 2021 to 2023. So collectively, we had 7 years of data. And to these, we kind of ended up contrasting these with another data set, which is, the Navy for FCLPs, they don't have their other operations posted but for FCLPs, they do post a schedule of FCLPs that are predicted for the week upcoming. And we have a data set that I've compiled over the last 2016 to 2024 based on those FCLP notifications of how many FCLP sessions are scheduled for that coming week for Altfield and for Coupeville. And I know what you're going to tell me. You're going to tell me that schedule is wrong. And I know it's wrong. But that will also work out. That's actually going to be really interesting later on too. And partly one answer to that is, well, it's kind of the only data that we have. And the second part is, again, I'll show you later why that schedule ends up being useful and important. But this gives us a time series of data, in terms of these published schedules, some indication of FCLP operations that are at least going to be consistent. Like for the most part, they're consistently wrong throughout the years, okay? And it gives us a time series. We also can tell the shift, some pivot points. For example, before 2019, there was more between the FCLPs were more evenly distributed between Alt and Coupeville, and then after 2019. So we can have these sort of time points to utilize when we're thinking about the impacts that have been come from the and what can be tracked in the complaint data. Okay, next slide. So this is just a quick snapshot of sort of the differences between these two data sets, some of the key differences. I told you for the Navy complaint line, we had 2017 through 2020, and then we sort of put that together with 2021 through 2023 from the Quiet Skies website. The location accuracy is a little different. We only have zip code in one, and we have actually, latitude and longitude in the Quiet Skies. There's big difference in the number of complaints per year. So the Navy complaint line is actually not, they don't encourage complaints. They encourage people to call with concerns about operations, but they do not actually encourage people to call with sort of general complaints and they don't promise to get back to you, which they rarely get back to people. So they're really different in purpose, whereas the Quiet Skies website is in order to catalog and document and communicate the impact. So they're generated, these data sets are generated for very different purposes. And so they have different, kind of volumes. The Navy, from 2017 to 2020, the number of complaints per year varied, but it's roughly between 900 and in 2020, it went up to almost 4,000 per year. But that's like in the Quiet Skies website collects between 11,000 and 14,000 complaints per year. So the scale is quite different in terms of the numbers of complaints. The Navies have more comments. Quiet Skies have more just points and fewer with comments. We were able to say, well, how many unique callers or unique people do we have, individuals reporting over time? For the Navy, again, they have that unique identifier. So we were able to know that there were about approximately over 2,300 individual households, calling in during that time. We were able to estimate that for the quiet skies. And so we estimate between 5 and 8,000 individuals or households reporting to that over those 3 years. And again, they are different in purpose. Okay, but that's just sort of snapshot between these two. All right, next slide. So the first thing that I talked about is we can analyze these complaints for using, it's called sentiment analysis. It's also called natural language processing. But basically what it does is it's analyzing the prevalence of different types of words in the text in order to go from unstructured words, which we have on the left over here, and then we're going to analyze the prevalence of certain dictionaries. You create dictionaries that are associated with different types of strengths and intensity of emotion, or negative sentiment, positive to negative sentiment. And then that comes out into being a scale. And so if you click if you do a click, Tara, okay, there we go. So what we can do is we can go from this unstructured text to something that can, like an index or a scale. So each complaint is going to receive a negative sentiment scale. And what that does is it allows us to do things like we can map those spatially, we can analyze changes in that over time, we can compare groups, we can compare different time periods, right? So it goes from it allows us to have a way to compare and contrast either changes over space and time in the negative sentiment. And since these are all complaints, we assume that there's negativity is just going to range in variation of the strength and its intensity, right? Okay, next slide. So I showed this main result from the sentiment analysis. There were others too that are going to be in the paper, but this was kind of the main one. I'll show this one for the area, and then there's one for the Olympic Peninsula. What you're looking at here is each of these complaints from the Quiet Skies, 3 years of complaints from the Quiet Skies data set that have been scaled based on the less to more negative, the strength of the negative sentiment. And then these are mapped. What you see underlying are those modeled noise contours, that are come from, say, the EIS. And so what you're looking at is sort of clouds of negative sentiment. And that does tend to correspond. So if we were going to map the number of complaints, there would be a relationship there. But the nice thing about sentiment analysis is it does actually, it is not necessary. It's not driven only by numbers of complaints. It's driven by the intensity or the angriness because the content of the complaint contains more angry words. It contains more negative words. It contains more fearful words, right? So it's going to sort of, it'll be correlated with the number of complaints, but it's not dependent on the number of complaints. So here you're looking at clouds of negative sentiment. And one of the things that really, really strikes me and has continued to strike me is that we do see pockets of these, of course, around the airfields, but we are also seeing a lot of this outside of the areas, even completely outside the modeled noise contours. And that gets at something that we kind of already know, but this allows us a way to visualize it, which is that the modeled average noise that is used in the impact assessment is not capturing or not reflecting what is actually happening on the ground. Now, we don't know exactly what is driving that at this point. The next analysis that I show you will get into that a little bit, but at least we have a way to actually document, like, the correspondence between the modeled noise contours and the impact is not good. It's just not good. And then, okay, so then the next slide shows that a little bit more, is that this is the same thing for the Olympic Peninsula. Now, we don't have modeled noise contours for the Olympic Peninsula. It's just modeled as kind of not very noisy. But, and there are, of course, fewer people out there, so we're not seeing as many complaints, but we still see, pockets of strong negative sentiment that are reported from noise complaints out there as well. Okay, so that is the sentiment analysis. And then in the full paper, we also have maps that actually document not just negative sentiment, but anger, and then also expressions of profanity driven by, like, when are people, like, so incoherent that so we have a couple of different ways to tackle that. The next way that we analyze these complaints is we wanted to know, well, what are the complaints about? And So the way that we did this is, again, this is kind of, it's automated. It's based on recognition of certain trigger words. You could call them trigger words. So if the aspect of certain trigger words is present in the complaint text, then it's going to classify to that. So if someone talks about being disrupted at work, or they had a meeting disrupted, or they, can't teach online, or whatever it is that they're doing, right, that's going to end up getting flagged or classified into work disruption. If they talk about shaking of their home, that's going to be, going to correlate to home damage. Kids and sleep, right? These trigger words end up classifying to these different categories. And what we have on the left-hand side, we have on the far left, we have 21 subcategories that are within 7 broad categories. So the 7 categories are colored: work, recreation and socializing, quality of life, people mentioning their children, their home enjoyment and their use, the environment, and health concerns. So we have these 7 broad categories, and within that we have 21 subcategories. And you see on the left-hand side, we have the Navy data set. And on the right-hand side, we have the Quiet Skies data set. So these are 2 different complaint data sets. The Navy line is 4 years, 2017 to 2020. Quiet Skies on the right-hand side, rather, is 2021 to 23. Those graphs look really pretty darn similar, which to a researcher, it helps me feel confident that we can approach this method and classify 2 completely different data sets and get basically the same results. And so people really are troubled and angered and upset about the same types of things, and they're reporting the same types of things. So then we can start to say, well, what are the top categories, right? And sleep is one of them. Sleep disruption is the top darker blue bar. We also have a lot of people reporting in the relaxation, like they have trouble, it's interrupting relaxation and socializing, and then home use. So people not being able to go out in their garden, not being able to sit out on their deck, not being able to, have a barbecue, that kind of thing. Home use of their home being compromised in some way is reported as really high. So those were the top 3 categories, but we see complaints being registered across all these different categories. And again, to go back to why we would do this, it gets us beyond it when we're doing a survey, or anyone doing noise research is doing a survey. They're usually only going to be limited to ask about, were you annoyed and what was your sleep disturbance, and maybe something else. And this allows us to look at a really broad range of different types of impacts that are happening in people's homes and communities. Okay, the next slide just breaks this down a little bit more. It's the same data. It's just that now we've broken it out by county, because we might expect some differences between, say, folks that are out in Clallam County. They might be reporting different types of impacts than, say, someone that's in Island County right around the airfield, right? And we do see some variation there. There are, like, use, home use, but really it was kind of impressive that every place that we looked, we're registering impacts almost across all of the categories, really. So there is a little bit here and there, and many of them are predictable. People that are near the airfield are going to have more complaints about the schedule and that kind of thing. But again, overall, we're seeing a lot of related impacts or similar impacts across all the different areas that are reporting. Okay, next slide. So then the last type of analysis here, this is modeling. And this was the question we wanted to say, well, what is predicting the number of complaints per day? And you don't have to worry too much. This modeling, it actually worked out really well. And again, I applied this modeling to both the Navy data set and the Quiet Skies data set and got essentially identical results, which is extraordinary. I can't even tell you how helpful that is when you get, can run through 2 different data sets through and get basically identical results. This is the one for the Navy. So we tested, the number of complaints against weather, against FCLP operations, against year in general. So if you click, Tara, there's one button, there's a couple of animations that come in. Okay, so in general, season, year, 2020 was big, but in general, season and year and weather were not that important, especially season and year. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because we know that the operations are year round. There's not really a seasonal trend to them, and year to year they do go up and down, but there's not really that one. 2020 we think is mostly driven by the pandemic and then also the major change in operations. So 2020 was a big year. But what we did find is that each of those, there's three categories there: day, so this would be FCLP is scheduled during the day, FCLP is scheduled during the night, and then FCLP is scheduled late night, which would be, I think, after 10 p.m. And each of those, the 1.5, 1.35, those are increases in the odds of complaints happening. So you can see late night FCLPs, it more than doubles the odds of complaints, and the day and the night. So, an FCLP session, each FCLP session during the day increases the odds of complaints by 1.5. Each FCLP session in the late night increases the odds of complaints by more than double that. So that's really the biggest drivers. People are basically responding to the presence of operations. If you click again, more, and then one more. Okay, we even looked at, there was an interesting trend the day prior. So we looked at the sort of lag. Is there a lag in when people report complaints? And so the one day prior was predictive of complaints. So there's kind of this trend, I think, where people wait. They sort of listen to it for a day, and then it goes in the next day, and then they call, right? And so we saw that there's sort of a thresholding. It takes people a little while to sort of work up to complain. So there was some interesting things there, but basically they're responding to these operations, and especially the late night operations. Okay, next slide. So one of the things I want to point out, the reason that that's so important, you're saying, of course, they're responding to the operations. What else would they be complaining about? But it's good to have that in the data, because this is an example. So as part of, this is an example of sort of some internal summaries that the Navy uses, and it's also on their website as well. Not this one, but there's another summary on their website. And one of the things that they kind of lean on, Tara, if you click, there's an animation. This idea of frequent callers is sometimes a feature of both the internal summaries that they do, but it's also on their website. And they kind of say, well, we got a lot of calls from frequent callers. And in the course of doing these complaints data, we noticed something kind of strange, and we confirmed it with the Navy. And so if you click one more time, Tara, sorry, one more, is that we found that a frequent caller was if someone had called more than twice at any point in this, because our data set covered 4 years. And so people that had called more than twice, at that point, they become a frequent caller. And I think that's a little bit important. And I'm pretty sure I know why they're doing it that way. It's probably a database issue and it's simpler and stuff like that. But it probably, I don't think it's accurate to classify someone that calls more than twice as a frequent caller and then to use that in the communication, right? You want to be careful about how because then there's kind of this dismissive quality to it, where, they're just frequent callers. They're just, and that happens a lot in complaints, is that the complaints get sort of blamed on a number of people that, frequent callers. So this is not an unusual approach. It's just that I think it can be somewhat not good. I'll just say not good. I think having the data shows that people are in fact responding to operations that are happening right then. They are, upset or aggravated about something that's going on at that time, and they want something. So I think that modeling is useful partly for that, and partly we want to point out this frequent callers thing that we've noticed as well. Okay, last slide, I think, and then we can open it for discussion. So just some key takeaways from the analysis of the complaints is that the sentiment analysis, we're seeing strong and consistent negative emotion, anger, from the community over time. It's not really going away. It's persistent. It is outside of the modeled noise contours. And so the modeled noise doesn't seem to be corresponding with the impact of people on the ground. And that actually relates to the survey that Edmund showed when we talked about that high variation. We're seeing in some ways, I think, the same phenomenon here. We're seeing a lot of variation that doesn't have to do with the modeled noise exposure. The complaints, we did see people complaining, about sleep disturbance and about obviously annoyance, but also mental health and concerns about their cardiovascular health, that kind of thing. So there were health concerns for sure, but there were many aspects of life relating to quality of life that were reported beyond that as well. And these include use of their home for work or relaxation, unpredictability, not being able to plan was a big one, fear and stress responses, and then their ability to recreate. And then lastly is that we do see that complaints are strongly predicted by the operations that are going on and maybe especially, and so they are, I think they can be considered a really good indicator of the impact that people are experiencing. I think that's the last slide in mine. I just wanted to say this is just some ways in which these data might be used. I don't know whether they would be, but I just wanted to brainstorm and we can talk about this more, right now. But knowing that when you ask someone, does this noise bother you? Knowing their history and it can actually impact their perception of the problem and the importance that the problem has or how much it's being impacted in their life. So I think that's important to note. Um, the methods that we've developed, especially the sentiment analysis and the complaint classification analysis, in some ways they're coded, so they kind of present an automated way to methodology that can be used over time to continue to analyze complaints, both around Whidbey Island, but then maybe elsewhere as well. We have more evidence that the average model noise contours are not capturing the impact on people's lives, and that those impacts are going beyond health, go beyond health and sleep, which is a really big deal, but also incorporate diverse aspects of quality of life. So, okay, I think that's all I've got. Sorry, this sun is like blinding.
All right, let me go ahead and I'll leave it on this last slide for a bit as I go through some chat. Let me start with the ones in the chat first. And this may have been answered, but maybe we can expand it on. From Breck, please compare noise harms versus harms to other sense organs like smell and vision in terms of personal objections and political response to quote unquote complainers.
Well, Edmund, I can try that. You might you actually you might know because of your work with air pollution. So the out of the way that people for noise anyway, the way that people have said it is that it's sort of psychologically mediated. But basically what that means is the way that you feel about a sound source is going to sort of moderate or modulate how you experience it. And this is a challenge, especially when the response, like if we were going out and measuring people's heart rate, that might be something that might be high, whether you say it's not impacting you or whether it's not, right? But when you're asking people how you feel about something, and so a lot of social surveys are done by just self-reporting, asking people how they feel about it. So it's been known for noise. Probably, I think that it also has been shown for like visual, if you're asking whether something is visually, upsetting or pleasing, I believe that is also the same way, like how you feel about the source, impacts your perception of it. I'm less familiar though, like Edmund, and I like to ask you if you know anything, but like if there's more objective measurements, like, I don't know, heart rate or cortisol or those types of things, does that actually go that far? And then also like, are there other like air pollution or something? Does that the same phenomenon happen, I guess, with other types of pollutants or exposures?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for kind of mentioning the air pollution aspect. That this we talked a lot today about kind of perceived noise and that being different than just like what a noise monitor might pick up. And I think it has a lot to do with how people experience noise, and part of that experience has to do with kind of understanding co-exposures that may occur. And so, we do a lot of studies in the SeaTac area. So it's different than military aviation noise. But the folks often ask us about kind of the contrails and the air pollution impacts that are also occurring, co-occurring with noise exposures. And we've done a lot of air pollution measurements where, we've identified really small, very, very small particles that are arguably the worst kind for our bodies because they could just directly go into our bloodstream. And they're such small particles that once they're in our bloodstream, they could pass through a lot of the biological barriers that we think are there to protect us. They actually cannot protect us against such small particles like the blood-brain barrier, the placenta, and so forth and so on. So when folks hear about that evidence, they may not be able to smell or see the particles in the air, but if they hear the aviation, it triggers kind of that fear response and stress response of thinking about air pollution exposures as well, which is not helpful. Um, and so I think, different folks have different experiences, and part of that experience is thinking through these co-exposures and things that, they can perceive, but also thinking about, the fear associated with things that they can't perceive all that well, but they know are still there. And I should mention too, there's a whole separate field of psychoacoustics where, people will, sit you in front of a TV and they'll blast noise at you. And sometimes they'll show you certain images that go along with what you're seeing. And so they could try and tease out kind of what's visual versus what's auditory and whatnot. We don't do those kind of experiments in our lab, but that certainly is a field of science.
Hmm. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and read one of the comments that went into the chat that Edmund did respond to, but in case people aren't able to open the chat, Ken asked, "What do you make of the data outliers?" And Edmund responded that the outliers might reflect variations in how individuals perceive noise. Edmund showed how past military service affects noise perception and its relationship to annoyance, but in the paper they looked at other factors. Gender, age, and attitudes towards the Navy were also important non-acoustic factors. And also importantly, even after controlling for these variations, perceived exposure to military aviation noise was found to be strongly and statistically significantly associated with both high noise and sleep disturbance. I'm
I'll just
gonna
add to that, the noise models, have some limitations, and particularly because we model a specific kind of dB that just averages everything out. And so a lot of our perception may have to do with, the unpredictability and, usually it's quiet, but then when the jets are out there, they're super annoying and we perceive them to be super loud. So I think the way that we model and measure noise with instruments and computers also can be wrong.
hmm. Okay, Art has his hand up. I'm gonna ask to unmute. Art, go ahead.
First off, I'd like to thank the UW for the study. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. My name is Art. I was a Navy officer back during Vietnam, so I guess I qualify as a past military. I'm on the board of Sound Defense Alliance, and I live almost exactly halfway between the Coopville airfield and the main air base up north. And right now, they are doing SCLPs at Coopville, and I can hear them from my house, but it's not a problem. So my question, and I couldn't do this in writing, is proximity to the jets makes a huge difference. And I had experience where I was working on a friend's house down near the Coopville runway, and the jets were making their northern turn right over their house. And the trees at their house are about 150 feet tall, big fir trees, and the planes are about twice that high in the air. So they were flying like 300 feet. That's a guess. But they were low enough so that I know there was lieutenant commander and two lieutenants because we could read the rank on the side of the fuselage. Couldn't read the name because that was printed less. I found that by 2 or 3 in the afternoon, if they were doing their testing, I was getting fatigued. And so I asked the homeowner, does he have any idea how loud these jets are? And he reached in his pocket and pulled out a handheld dB meter. And we measured 5 passes of the 3 jets. And we averaged 132 to 136 dB. Now, I admit that's a handheld meter. It could be errors, but your sound map, the highest dB level you've mentioned was 90. And the Navy does averaging. And on the Navy's map, the zone I was in listening to 132 to 136 dB was labeled 70 to 75 dB. Now, I also know that when the jets weren't flying, the most noise complaint we had was the damn birds. And so my question is, is the impact of incident noise? I also have a friend that lives right underneath the flight path of the FCLPs who actually had a bowl vibrate off a shelf and break on the floor because of the jet. Now I wouldn't call that noise, but that's the vibrations. And so my question is, that incident causing extreme fatigue, I had earplugs and ear muffs and my ears were protected, but my body wasn't. That I knew, and I didn't phone in a complaint, but that incident noise is so extreme compared to what I'm hearing now or being a mile away or is averaging. And that's what the Navy does, is average. And the Navy says, well, gee, the average noise is only 75 dB, therefore it's irrelevant. I submit if you get hurt by an incident that, I don't know, what is your comment to that in terms of incident noise versus average, and I forget the term you used.
I can take a whack at that. So I mentioned early on that noise pollution in general is very, very weakly regulated, very weakly regulated. And so when the Navy produces the model noise averages, they're basically following the conventions and protocols that would apply to a commercial airport. Having a model noise contour of 90 around a commercial airport, well, I don't even know. Like you wouldn't see development around that contour, right? And so what they're doing is they're using the conventions that apply to a commercial airport, even though the regulations that would apply around a commercial airport, which are really complicated, but we'll call them regulations. So the regulations that would apply around a commercial airport don't apply to this situation. So basically, we're using models that were designed and developed for commercial aviation, which is much quieter and much more consistent and frequent. So an average noise around a commercial airport is more representative of what's actually happening. Whereas what you're having is loud, extremely loud noise. And by the way, under the flight paths of the FCLPs, what we've measured is pretty routinely, it can hit 115 to even upwards of 118. So 132, 136, probably that was your handheld meter, probably, but it's hard to say. But when we do monitoring, it's usually under the flight paths of the FCLPs, it's going to be something like 115 to 118, which is really, 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 really loud. But the fact that we're seeing, I mean, I think when you think about it, like, you see a contour of 75, but those jets aren't flying that often. So to get a contour of 75 means that they're really loud when they fly there. So it doesn't mean that the modeling's wrong. It means that the modeling is not well suited to reflect what is actually happening. So I don't, there's a lot more. Edmund, I'll let you have a go at it because there's a lot to say there.
Yeah, Arthur, you said it more eloquently with a story than I tried to explain earlier. But I think it's a problem with how we currently document noise with dB levels that have long averaging periods. And so that goes to Lauren's point as well. I mean that these dBs, these 24-hour averages that are then averaged across an entire year, end up kind of not really capturing, the intensity of a single Passover that happens, over and over again for a few hours over a few days. But when you start looking, at just the background noise, the birds, as you mentioned, those are basically bringing all that averaging down. And I think the military, as well as other industries and civil aviation and whatnot, they use these long-term averaging as a way um, to meet regulations by just having it allows them to get away with really intense short periods of noise um, just because of, that's how those metrics work. So you could argue we should be using better metrics, and I would agree with you.
All right, and then Brian asked, did you use analysis from reports who include noise level? And I assume, Brian, you mean in the Quiet Skies reports, people sometimes when they send in their complaint, they'll include their noise level that they recorded at the time.
No, we ended up not using that. I think we didn't have a good way to use it, partly because during complaints analysis, it was easier and more sort of systematic to use the noise contours to contrast that. And then the other parts of the complaint analysis didn't incorporate that. There might be ways to bring that in, though, now to go back and relook at that. Sort of we made some decisions early on and didn't see a way to use it then, but it doesn't mean that we've exhausted all the possibilities with those data by any means. So there's definitely, more that could be done there. So we could relook at the noise categories that were captured. So.
Okay, thank you. I have a question that it's kind of maybe a two-part question, but essentially I was wondering before, is it helpful to identify some of those invisible impacts that even though maybe some people who have a military background or just don't find the jets to be very annoying at all, even though they have a different perceived impact than other people who might find it very triggering, are there certain impacts that are just always going to impact everyone, whether or not you perceive them or not? I know you mentioned the particulates, and then obviously at a certain decibel level, that's going to impact everyone. And then I guess the second half of my question is it helpful for people to know that? Or like Edmund says, is that actually harmful? So where's the balance between raising awareness and providing education with this, but also not wanting to contribute more to people's stress as they understand these impacts more deeply?
So, I think it's important to understand that a lot of these exposures, even though this community has kind of dealt with them for quite a long time, and that's why it's so frustrating. Um, they can be mitigated, and it was great to hear Marion, um, talk about some of the successes with respect to kind of mitigations at the schools and other places that you know. There's varying levels of successes, and I think low frequency rumble, that vibration is really hard to mitigate. Um, but but anything that we could do to kind of reduce those exposures, and on the air pollution side, I think when we have wildfire smoke episodes, we're now kind of accustomed to kind of thinking about, wildfire smoke preparedness for our homes and having some air filtration and going out less, on those smoky days. So when we can perceive things, it's better because then we can work on ways in which we protect ourselves. It's those things that, are more challenging to perceive or more challenging to control that ends up being the scariest. But we can do things to kind of mitigate noise as well as air pollution.
Hmm. Okay, thank you.
To that, Tara, I would also add that, like, there's a lot that we don't know about environmental exposures and how they impact people. Like we only kind of know what's been studied, and sometimes those things, for different reasons, sometimes those things are very unevenly studied and they're difficult to study, so we don't always know them. And so I guess I tend to err toward, maybe not err, encourage people to value their own experience because that's data too. And just because something hasn't been documented in some study or hasn't been documented very well, I think that it can be indicative. You know, if the same if 100 people start reporting the same thing, that becomes, you know, something that the people can say, okay, well, maybe we do need to warrant looking into this more. And Art, what you had said about how you feel tired, I think that's a really good example of something like that, where there is information in the literature that would support that, but it probably hasn't been systematically studied. Like, do people exposed to noise for hours at a time get tired? You know, like probably that it's a completely reasonable response, but it probably just hasn't been like systematically studied yet. But if 100 people start reporting the same thing, then it becomes something that becomes less anecdotal and something that's of more interest. And the other thing too is that it can help validate when, you know, like Edmund said, this community has been dealing with this for a long time. So people have shared information, but there are, say, I think it's the airfields in Michigan that are F-35. That's a newer community. And I sometimes see things coming out where people are like, I feel weird, or I have headaches, or, you know, like things that Whidbey Island folks would say, well, yes, of course you do. But folks out in Michigan are like, they're learning all these things for themselves, unfortunately, for the first time. So I think that there's knowledge that can be shared across communities that may not, um, yeah, there that your experience can benefit other people. So
Mm.
I'd also like to maybe change my answer. One thing that we try and kind of teach our students in environmental health is, you know, really when we're talking about mitigations and personal protection and whatnot, that's kind of a last resort. And so I'd like to change my answer to, you know, the ideal situation is to reduce emissions and reduce the flights. And so, you know, perhaps interesting questions are, you know, why does the Navy need to do so many flights? Why do they need to do so many practices? Does it all have to be here? Um, does it have do the flight routes need to all be so concentrated over particular homes? So, you know, if the answers to those questions could help reduce the amount of flights or the intensity of flights over a particular period, all of those would, you know, be better in terms of reducing exposures than having people, you know, try and retrofit their homes or spend more time indoors and whatnot. It's getting more at the source of the problem.
Right. Yeah. And Breck asked, what intensity/duration of noise exposure in an OSHA monitored workspace requires hearing protection?
Completely different. So OSHA, the regulations are 8 hour work shifts. Um, and the way that they measure noise for occupational, the exchange rate, like how quickly the changes in the noise levels register on the noise are different than environmental noise measurements. So there's quite a bit different in the OSHA world um, than the environmental noise world. Um, the levels are typically much higher for the acceptable dose for an 8 hour work shift than for environmental noise.
Hmm. Okay. And I do know, in terms of just loudness and health, I believe it was Arlene Bronzaft, who's a renowned noise researcher who passed recently. I believe today's actually her birthday, but she said, you know, if you're standing in front of someone and you're shouting, it's too loud. And so that's a good way to kind of judge whether or not you need to remove yourself from that situation. And we are coming to the end of our time. I just wanted to wrap up with a final question for Lauren and Edmund. After reading all these reports and going through these surveys, do you have a recommendation for people in terms of reporting going forward? Do you want people to continue reporting as they have been, or do you have any suggestions for what may be useful for research in the future?
Well, I mean, the complaints were a very, what would be considered a very rich source of data. Not that I like to be saying that people's misery gives rich data. Like there's something kind of weird about that. But if you want to consider that the quality of the complaints, that maybe quality is the wrong way, the type of data that are contained in those complaints, and which Quiet Skies has done a long, they have a long history of summarizing and using those data as well. I think we're hoping that what we've done here can complement that or, help that in some way. But Quiet Skies already summarizes that data and sends it to, and communicates it with congresspersons, and so does SDA. So, I mean, I think reporting, uh, it's tiring. It's tiring. I know it's tiring to do the same things and feel like folks aren't getting anywhere and making any changes, but I think that I've been incredibly impressed with the work that SDA, Quiet Skies, CORE have done. There have been wins. So I think what everybody is doing is really good. I encourage folks to keep doing that, keep raising awareness, keep spreading the word, and also keep believing in yourselves in a way. Like you're not wrong. It's really loud, unconscionably loud. um, so yeah, that's the best I can do right now. I'll think about it too. I can get back to y'all as well.
I have
I,
one
I
last I have one last
please go ahead.
question. Is there something from your research and data that you can suggest some policy mitigations on noise that we could share with the Navy? I mean, this is where we're at right now, is we're trying to figure out what mitigations we can offer to the Navy as reasonable response to the data that's been collected. And it would be really helpful for us to know, since you're more intimate with all the details of the data, to get some suggestions from you all who've worked on this, of some mitigations that we could suggest that would put less impactful noise over the people who are getting the worst noise.
The first thing that springs to mind is those night flights. I
Hmm.
mean, I think like all of the flights are bad, but if I look at the data, I would say that the night flights are really what are making people just go bananas. Oh no, you know what? There's another thing. There's another thing. The unpredictability. So one of those categories of complaints, which is really high, is people saying like, they're like, I try and plan my life around this. You publish the schedule. I really try. I schedule my work meetings here. I schedule this. But they're like, I can't plan anything. I can't plan a birthday party. I can't plan. And so the late night flights, the unpredictability, reducing the unpredictability, whether by better scheduling or I'm not sure how to reduce the unpredictability, but the unpredictability is really hard on people. And then the third thing is, which I've forgotten now. I'll remember it. Edmund, I'll come back to the third thing that I remembered.
Well, I do want to highlight that unfortunately right now, due to the world events we're seeing, the Navy has actually stopped releasing their schedule, which we all know that wasn't predictable anyways, but it is quite unfortunate now that we're facing the impacts of complete unpredictability.
Yeah, now it's completely unpredictable. Oh, I remember the thing. Yeah, late night flights, unpredictability, and taking seriously the stress and fear. So there's a lot of complaint in data in the complaint content that relates to like, this is making me afraid to be in my home. And maybe not afraid that a plane's going to crash into my home, but that like my house is shaking. Things are, you know what I mean? Like that kind of stress and fear is somehow I think it just doesn't get captured at all. And you see it in the complaints information,
Hmm.
but I don't see it in any of the other data that I see or that comes out. So elevating that and taking that really seriously.
Yeah, just on the stress and fear, I was actually surprised by the military attitude findings because I thought it may actually have go the other way, where folks who have had military service, hearing jets might actually be triggering for PTSD and other sorts of things, but there may also be a self-selection issue where folks who have PTSD, might not be able to stand living in these communities. And so those are not the folks who are, living in the community or participating in our survey. Yeah, I did leave a comment in the chat about back one question about, how valuable are the noise complaints and do we need to still, I think they are very valuable. And I just sort of reflect on things that I've read about the history of noise policy in the US. It largely grew out of complaints and legal matters and uh, airport communities and folks who are living next to military bases. This is when there wasn't any regulation whatsoever in the US, and it all grew out of complaints. Um, and from then people started making measurements, and then they went away from looking at complaints and purely looking at measurements. And now we're going full circle where we're finding, well, maybe it's the complaints and perceived noise, which is much, much more valuable than the actual measured noise levels.
Mhm.
All right,
Thank
well, thank you all. There is one last question in the chat from Zoltan who said, how many growlers are now deployed to the war and has there been a drop in local maneuvers? And I just wanted to quickly answer that. I'm not actually sure how many are currently deployed. I know as of, I believe, February, there were at least 6 deployed. I think they were first deployed in Venezuela, and then those same 6 may have gone out. And so I'm not sure the exact number, and I'm not sure they're gonna really set information. But I don't think there has been a drop in local maneuvers. I think if anything, their training has been heightened. But we will see, that feedback from the community when Quiet Skies releases their next report summary. And so, yeah, keep reporting, everyone, and send us your stories. But thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, Lauren, Maren, and Edmund, and keep reporting. Thank you, everyone, for the research that's being done. It's all going hand in hand, the advocacy and research. So thank you all so much.
you.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.